online learning for everyone. I like this map because I grew up a little north of Boston, and Thin Mints looked a particular way to me. And then I moved to different parts of the world, and Thin Mints looked different from the way I was expecting them to look. So it turns out there are two different types of Girl Scout cookie bakers, and it's not just Thin Mints that are affected by the cookie bakers of Girl Scout cookies. So if ever in the future you end up someplace and you open a box of Thin Mints and you think, what the heck is this? It may be because you're in a different geography. So fun facts. All right, tip of the day is relevant for anything, anytime you're dealing with computing or any kind of software glitches, which is that if you run into an error code, try Googling it, because sometimes, like in this case, it's actually a really simple solution. So some of you guys may have seen this in working through Lab 6. You may see it again in working through Lab 7. But this error code from ArcMap that says a tool isn't licensed. And basically what you need to do is just go into the extensions and turn on this tool so that you can use it. So if you run into these types of problems, odds are that other people have run into these problems. There are lots of good forums on the internet, so make good use of them. It's key to any kind of advanced computing is learning from other people's mistakes and your own. All right, so the topic of today is remote sensing. And remote sensing basically means, anything where you've got some sort of instrument that is sensing something from far away. So most of what I'm going to be talking about, I think all of what I'll talk about today is satellite remote sensing. But remote sensing could also be, something like, trying to get underneath the earth by using, like penetrating radar or something like that, trying to understand what like the structure of the soil looks like, using radar or sonar to understand and map the bottom of the ocean. It's not necessarily only something that's up in space or up in the air. So why do we even talk about remote sensing? Well, remote sensing is a source of a lot of different data that you might be using. So any land cover maps that you would be using, land cover change maps, maps of vegetation type, maps of geology. A lot of times those are coming from satellite data that people have processed and analyzed to create this product for you. And so anytime you have a map, right, a satellite product, that is something that you can pull into GIS and use. So and most of what I'm going to talk about today is satellite data that comes specifically from basically light, so a satellite that is measuring the reflectance of light coming back to a sensor that's on board the satellite. So before we can talk too much about light, we have to talk a little bit about color. So what is going on with color? Color is basically what our eye is able to see of the visible spectrum. So basically you have this really long spectrum of energy that's coming off of the sun, all the way up from really high energy stuff that fortunately our atmosphere blocks out. So, we can have life on Earth without getting fried, basically, into the ultraviolet beyond what we can see. And then here's this tiny little band that our eye can pick up, but we have then all of this infrared, we've got radar, radio waves, really broad waves beyond what our eye can see, and a little bit beyond what our eye can see in the shorter wavelength end as well. So just because our eye can't see it doesn't mean that a satellite eye can't see it too. So satellites have been built to see effectively see way out here, a little bit in here. As you go further in this direction, basically the atmosphere blocks out more and more light, so it doesn't really make sense to look, you know, here because there's just not much going on. But it does make sense to look out here. And so what a satellite potentially sees is basically the sun is shining, or even if it's cloudy, there's still light coming through, although if it's cloudy, your satellite probably isn't going to see too much. So really you're looking for a sunny day. You've got the sun shining down, that light is bouncing off of objects, or, you know, so basically some of it is bouncing, some of it is getting absorbed, and the combination of those different things gives you these different colors. So whether color is what we see in the visible spectrum, or color might also be what a satellite can see beyond the visible spectrum. So lots of stuff is going down to the Earth, and some of it is bouncing back up into the atmosphere, so that you get those, you know, beautiful pictures of the Earth from space kind of thing. All of that is light that has reflected off of the sun and is coming up to your eye or your camera in space. So lots of stuff happening beyond what we can see, right? And here's a good example of this from something that many of you guys may have seen with building and construction. So you can take a thermal, so this is in the heat spectrums, which is, you know, in that infrared, thermal picture of some buildings, right? And here are some examples of buildings where there's a lot of heat coming off the roof of, you know, this building, a lot of heat coming off of the windows of these buildings. So if we're talking about trying to make things more efficient, those would be the places to start in terms of improving insulation. So here's a question. So why are leaves green, right? It's something that we kind of take for granted. You see all these different colors, you know, like a leaf is green because it's green, right? Well, it turns out the reason that a leaf is green is because more green light is reflected off of that leaf, and more of the red and the blue light that might otherwise make that leaf, you know, white or something like that if it was reflecting in all wavelengths. The red and the blue is getting absorbed. And so what's bouncing off of that leaf is what your eye is able to actually see, and everything else is absorbing into the leaf. So why are red and blue wavelengths absorbing into this leaf? Well, that kind of brings up the, so these are spectra for you guys to look at. Why are red, so here's red, this is the visible spectrum down here, this is what we can see. Everything out here is stuff that we cannot see, so our eye cannot see, but sensors, remote sensors, have been built to see all of these wavelengths out here. So this green one is vegetation. So over here is blue, in the middle is green, and over here is red, and then this is the edge at which we can no longer see, basically, like our eyes kind of cut off right about here. So the reason that that leaves are green is because they are absorbing really strongly in the blue, and they're absorbing really strongly in the red. And those have to do with photosynthesis, basically. Chlorophyll absorbs. There are two types of chlorophyll, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and they absorb really strongly in the blue and the red, and also in the green, just not quite as much as these ones. So generally, plants are pretty dark. Actually, a green leaf, if you were to imagine it in kind of grayscale, would be relatively dark. So compare that to just beyond what our eye can see. And in this wavelength, so this is the near infrared, is what NIR stands for. That is a place that our eye can't see. Plants are no longer absorbing anything, basically. They're like, I'm getting all that I need down here. And boom, you have this really bright near infrared reflectance. Some of the stuff that's going on out further out has to do with absorptions associated with like lignin and cellulose out here. These are big water absorptions, so there's a lot of water in healthy vegetation, so that's why you have these big kind of features out here. But generally, the key thing for vegetation that's very distinct from basically anything else on Earth is that it's really dark in the visible and really bright in the near infrared. So you can compare that to these couple of soils. So the black one is one kind of soil and the red one is some other type of soil. Water tends to be pretty dark. Reflectance, kind of if you imagine a picture of the ocean, it's pretty dark, but more blue because blue is on this end. So just a comparison that things look pretty different, both in the visible, but also in the beyond what our eye can see. And so here are some examples of images taken from satellite. So this one is actually in Western Australia. It's a not really a lake, it's a salt lake called Lake Disappointment. And it was named that because early explorers in Western Australia, this is mostly desert, were kind of they started to see some water features and were kind of following along these, water ravines and hoping that they were going to get to fresh water at the end. And they ended up getting to this brackish salt lake at the end. So they were disappointed. So they named it Lake Disappointment. You might see in looking at this image that it looks really kind of weird, right? Like if you were in a plane flying over and you looked out and you were like, whoa, bright blue, bright yellow, that seems like a pretty odd landscape, right? And the answer is because it is an odd landscape. This is not a true color, what we would call a true color image. This is a false color image. And false color basically means that instead of putting the color bands in as your eye would see it, we've instead put color bands that the satellite could see, but your eye can't see. So for example, using some of those near infrared bands or the shortwave infrared, that was this swirr thing out here, the shortwave infrared, right? So if you can capture, some like weird things going on out here with the soil or with the lake itself, then you're going to end up with things that look a lot brighter, a lot different than they might originally. So here's another one, right? This is another example of a satellite image. You can see the scale bar in here is 10 miles, so this is a pretty large area. This is actually of the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. That's an area with a lot of mining, so you can see a lot of really interesting geology going on here. And the question is this visible color? And the answer to that is, would this look really weird to you? Would you think this is kind of a normal landscape if you were flying over in a plane? And to me, the answer to that is no, that is some weird looking stuff going on there. So probably it's a false color image. Again, we've taken these bands that the satellite can see, these wavelengths that the satellite can see, and sort of put them into the visible wavelengths so that our eye can pick it up, but that wouldn't actually be something that we would ever see in real life. Similarly, here's another example. So you've got some interesting things going on here in terms of some another interesting geology. So this is in Tanzania in Africa, west of Mount Kilimanjaro. So what you're seeing are a bunch of both older and younger volcanics. And so you can see from these kind of color differences how, and again, this is a false color image, not something that you would expect to see flying over in a plane. So you can see from this how we can use not only kind of true color or, an aerial photograph or an image set to what our eye can see, but we can also use this broader set of available wavelengths to try to characterize what's going on here. So for example, if you mapped out all of the purpley areas on here, those might be more recent active volcanism or something like that. So color is one good way that we can use to make a map, to take information and create more discrete raster grid out of it, where we say this is new volcanics and everything else is not, type of thing. Another thing that we can use to make maps, and this tends to be more in the heads-up digitizing realm, although it's getting better. So what I mean by that is that so in this past one, you could write some rules in GIS, for example. So in a simple case, you could say, find all the purple areas and call that, young volcanic flow or something like that. You wouldn't actually need to go in an editor and like trace the edges of all of those, right? Because you can identify the values of the reflected light that actually characterize that young volcanics and kind of write a rule for it. And I'm saying this in kind of a vague sense because all of this is like a, one lecture brief intro to remote sensing, but you could take a whole course on remote sensing if you wanted to do that and actually learn the techniques of how do you create an image classification so that you can identify these purple areas or young volcanic flow. So one way is to get the computer to basically make this classification for you. The other is to actually go into editor and draw those edges yourself, right? So textural differences are another example of how you could identify particular features. The one on the left is an oil palm plantation. Very clear textural difference, right? Because you've got these kind of rows of trees versus the native tropical forest next to it. Just looks very different. And then on the right side, you've got some suburbs. And so if I said, hey, can you show me all of the baseball diamonds in this suburb, your eye is able to pick that up and you would be able to, digitize it. To date, people are better at identifying texture than computers, but that technology continues to improve. So here's an example of another image. This is from the Namib Desert in Southern Africa and Namibia, where you've got these kind of cool morphological features too, right? So different patterns of sand dunes in here. And so, you could think about, well, here's an interesting image. What kind of hypotheses could we come up with related to this? Well, one might be, can we use the shadows or something like that to identify the height of these different sand dunes? Could we ask a question about which way the wind or the water tends to flow in this area based on, kind of the directionality of those different dune forms? Finding some sort of pattern in an image, you could always digitize kind of the directionality of those, or look at shadow and light or something like that. Just kind of lots of different possibilities out there when you have an interesting image. Right, so just to go back to that, why do we keep using false color, right? So all of those images, and this one included, is a false color image, not what you would see in actuality flying over that location. And the reason is that there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on in longer wavelengths. So that red box is what our eye can see. Everything out here is what the satellite can see, and the satellite could take any of these different bands where interesting stuff is happening, really bright versus really dark kind of thing, and put that information into a visible band so that, what your eye can't see instead looks bright red or something like that, or bright blue, whatever color you chose to view it as. So, for example, if you were really interested in looking at plants and identifying plants relative to, and again, the plant one is this guy, right? Plants relative to rocks or weathered soil or water or something like that. And a good option would be to focus on this band. And I keep using the word band, but what I mean is wavelength there. So For satellites, a lot of times the satellite I'm thinking of is a satellite that's been around for about 40 years at this point, which is called the Landsat satellite. It's a NASA satellite, and NASA has, Landsat has historically had 6 bands or 6 wavelengths that it kind of uses, 3 in the visible, so blue, green, and red, 1 in the near infrared right here beyond what we can see, and then 2 more in the shortwave infrared out here and out here. And they were chosen kind of specifically for areas where there's not a lot of water, not as much water absorption, so that the sensor could actually see some stuff bouncing back and not getting a ton of atmospheric interference. So band basically just means one of these kind of wavelength bands that Landsat uses. That's why I keep saying that. All right, so here is an example of a true color image. So this is of the Salton Sea, which, if you haven't heard of the Salton Sea, give it a quick Google, because it's really kind of an interesting story. This is in Southern California. It's a big water body that was basically created by accident, but is now a place that where there's lots of birds. Migratory birds love it, stop there. So, happy accident. So what we're seeing here in the middle is the kind of black patch is the water itself. Water mostly absorbs in all wavelengths, and so you just don't see a lot coming off of it. And then all of this kind of like mottled stuff to the south and east of the Salton Sea, that's all agricultural fields. So you can kind of, based on texture, see that it's agriculture, but it's definitely not popping out as color, right? So vegetation kind of looks dark, similar to like the surrounding geology. So this is using, so 3, 2, 1 up here basically means that, so 3 is the red band, that red is in red, 2 is the green band, green is in green, and 1 is the blue band, so blue is in blue, and that makes for a true color image. So here's another example. This is that same image, except instead of using red, green, and blue, we're using near infrared, red and green. So now what you're seeing in red is that band 4, which is the near infrared. So if we refer back, basically we're showing this band right here, which is really bright for vegetation, right? Reflecting a lot for vegetation. We're showing that as red. So now the vegetation really pops, right? You see tons of red out here. It's way more obvious where the vegetation was, including up in some of the mountains to the west of the Salton Sea, much different from this visible image. Here's another example of that. This is now putting that near infrared band, that really bright veg, into green instead, so that it shows up as green, and showing the mid infrared. So that's like basically out here, showing that wavelength as red. And so as I go back and forth, look at this one, look at these hills that are mountains really that are to the north of the Salton Sea, and see what you see as terms of geology here versus here, right? There's just a few things on there that kind of pop out a little bit more, look a little different, show up a little bit better. And that's just because there's different geology in those mountains to the north of the Salton Sea, and some materials absorb or reflect differently in that mid-infrared versus the near-infrared. So that's why it's kind of fun to use these different wavelengths to look at geology as well as vegetation. So because vegetation has this really unique signature of dark in the red, dark in the visible, and really bright in the near infrared, people have created a way to basically map vegetation kind of very specifically. So just looking at vegetation, and that's using this thing called NDVI. And NDVI stands for the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And it is basically just a ratio of the near infrared relative to the red. And so you end up with this scale of technically -1 to 1, but -1, those tend to be things like clouds or snow or ice, and so we don't worry too much about those. So effectively everything from 0 to 1, 0 is very little vegetation or no vegetation, so like a sand dune or something like that. And 1 would be, you know, like a tropical rainforest with tons of vegetation, you know, early growth vegetation. So just to see that again, so here's our visible image. NDVI, you'll notice, is just a single grayscale value, right? So it's just going to give you one thing out of this. It's going to be a value between 0 and 1, right? It doesn't have color associated with it. So you just end up with grayscale. So here's the true color image of the Salton Sea. Here's the NDVI equivalent. And again, if you're just focused on vegetation, this is a way to make that vegetation really, really obvious and kind of mask out everything else. The problem, though, is that NDVI, those values, tend to be kind of similar for different plants. So different plants have similar spectra, they have similar absorption and reflectance characteristics across these different wavelengths. And so it can be really tricky to differentiate kind of, you know, one particular, let's say like forest type from a different forest type. So like a deciduous forest from a coniferous forest, or a mixed conifer and hardwood forest, right? Those two in the middle of the summer might look pretty similar in terms of the overall greenness to a satellite. And I should say that the Landsat satellite that we were looking at before, the pixel size on this is 30 meters. So that's 30 meters by 30 meters. So you're not going to see any individual trees, right? You're going to see like just kind of a green haze type of thing, or we can pick up that this is an agricultural field, but you're not going to see any details about the crops. 30 meters is pretty coarse. So one of the things that that remote sensing experts have done is to identify land cover based on phenology. So phenology is basically sort of repeating biological events through time. And if you think about that deciduous versus coniferous forest, here's a good example where conifer forests, you know, keep their needles, right? So they go from, you know, less green to slightly more green through the year, whereas deciduous forests go from basically no greenness, no, you know, or brightness in near infrared to like super green in the middle of the summer and then back again. And so we can use these images to look at the timing of green up. And so here's kind of an interesting one for New England. It doesn't quite get out into Western Mass, but captures a good chunk of Southern Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut. And this is basically a stack of Landsat images looking at the average onset of leaf out. And so I love this image, it's kind of fun to look at, right? So the bluer ones are areas where you have earlier leaf out. So the spring arrives sooner, basically. So you can kind of look around and say like, okay, where are the areas that are bluer on here that had earlier seasons? Well, they kind of tend to be around coastlines. You can see that, you know, like around Rhode Island, you know, southern Rhode Island, this whole area. They also tend to be right around cities, right? So we might hypothesize that some of this is related to, you know, urban heat island or coastal warming in some areas. Then there's also this thing where you've got these really late green up features going on the Cape. And that actually is probably due to a specific vegetation type that's out there. So, you know, you have this particular type of tree that just greens up really late. So gives you some more sense of kind of what's going on in terms of land cover. And the other thing that you can kind of see is just this sort of modeling effect all over across the whole area of pretty big swings. So everywhere from this kind of like light green. So 110, this is like days, right? So we're talking about like a couple of weeks in terms of the difference between, you know, the mid blues to the mid greens. And the folks who wrote this is coming from a paper. The folks who wrote this paper found that a lot of that variation was due to actually to micro topography. So, and we're not talking about like huge cliffs or anything like that. We're talking about pretty gentle slopes in the forest, and just sort of the settling of colder air and the flow of colder air down these basically valleys, led to the trees greening up, you know, quite a bit later by like a week or two than the ones, their neighbors that were a little bit higher up on ridge lines. Pretty cool. And here's another neat example of something similar, looking at phenology, or the green up time over time in the early 2000s. And so what you can, you know, imagine from this, you've got some years where we had really early green up across the Northeast, some years where we had really late green up across the Northeast. We need more data on this for the 15 years following. Certainly if we're trying to look at kind of the signature of climate change on vegetation. But in these cases, we can see basically weather patterns on a year-to-year basis, slightly cooler years in the blue, slightly warmer years. And this kind of interesting potential answer to a question of, you know, what are the types of weather patterns that are really going to affect how the vegetation is responding? Is it growing degree day? Basically, is that an accumulation of warming over time? Is it a particular time period? Does rainfall affect it? I mean, these are all still kind of outstanding questions in science of how the plants on the landscape respond to climate. All right, so those are some really neat products. If you're interested in looking around for what kind of satellite data products exist, earthexplorer.usgs.gov is a really great resource for that. Lots of stuff on there, bazillions of things that I can't really guide you through, and sometimes they're slightly counterintuitive or non-intuitive, but keep clicking stuff until you break it, basically. So our take-home points on this is that you can create maps with remote sensing, or you can use somebody else's maps that they've created with remote sensing. So whether that's a phenology product or a land cover product, or something else that you find on Earth Explorer, that you can then analyze those maps with GIS, right? So for example, you know, I guess this particular, these aren't necessarily one-to-one, but for example, that phenology product that the scientists created, they compared to topography to see the effect of microtopography on the timing of green up. In that other example, the scientists compared that interannual variability and the overall timing of green up to climate conditions to try to see what came out as most interesting. So remote sensing, really great resource for data, for land cover maps, for raw data that you can create your own map out of, or, you know, analyze in a million different ways. All right, map of the day. As we finish up, I'll let you guys stare at that for 5 seconds to try to figure out what is it that is so different in the US relative to pretty much everywhere in the world, except for Canada and maybe South Asia and Australia and a little bit of East Asia. All of Africa, all of Europe, all of South America on board with this thing, but not the US. We're not into it. All right, here's the answer. It's, so football in this case being soccer, right? So pretty much the entire world loves soccer, except us. We are mostly into American football, except for places where we might be into basketball, or in the case of most of the Northeast, the baseball. Awesome, guys. Thanks for listening. I will be back more next week.